Rahul, if you could find out from Devkumar if we are streaming live and everything is fine.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, I'll call him.
Thanks. All good, Rahul?
I'm calling him. I'm just thinking.
हा देवकुमार झूम दिसतंय व्यवस्थित YouTube दिसतंय व्यवस्थित
मॅम अजून लाईव्ह सुरू झालेलं नाहीये त्यांना दिसत नाहीये जस्ट
आपल्याला इथे मेसेज येतोय पण इट इज लाईव्ह ऑन
there's a lag of a couple of minutes usually. Yeah, Rohini, yes, we are live. All big stars here.
येस मॅम लाईव्ह सुरू झालेलं आहे.
Yes, great. Yeah. So, okay, I have to kind of pin myself. Very good afternoon, very good morning to Professor O'Hanlon. Good afternoon to the people who are joining in from India. Welcome all of you to this course that has been in our minds for quite some time now, but it could not be put into practice for various number of reasons. But finally, we are all here together, and we are very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon, who is a great expert on historiography, South Asian history, and history and literature. So it's a real pleasure to be to be given this opportunity to spend this week, coming week, with Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon. As you all know that we will be listening to Professor O'Hanlon's lectures every day 3 to 5, and the course is entitled I'm just lost for the title of the course. Just give me a second. Yeah. History and Literature with Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon, and she'll be speaking, of course, about the post-colonial approaches in the contemporary world. This course is designed in such a fashion that Professor O'Hanlon has already shared her reading materials with all of us, and I hope most of us have completed the first day readings at least. She intends to speak, share her thoughts with the help of her PowerPoint presentation, and then she will invite questions from all of us, comments also from all of us. So all of us who are here on the Zoom call, for today we are a bit being cautious, and we are not allowing people to speak out today. But slowly, as things get settled, from tomorrow onwards, you will be able to raise your hands and ask questions tomorrow onwards. But before that, the formal introduction. Welcome all of you to the course on history and literature, and trying to make sense of both these things as we live in the post-colonial realities. Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon will be delivering this course over 5 days, and this course is supported by the IDS, that is the Interdisciplinary School for Social Sciences of our Savitribai Phule Pune University. So this is a joint collaborative effort that has been building up for a while now. May I invite the director of the IDS, Professor Rajeshwari Deshpande, to say a few words and to welcome Professor O'Hanlon on all our behalf. Professor Deshpande, please.
Thank you, Professor Kumbhojkar, Shraddha. And as she said, I'm basically here to welcome you all once again on behalf of the university, on behalf of the Department of History, but also the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, which of the humanities and social sciences disciplines, which is established by the government of Maharashtra in our university long back. And the main sort of task that is assigned to this Center of Interdisciplinary Studies is to bring together the various departments of social sciences and humanities. And in that sense, it is indeed really truly a privilege and an honor for this center as well as for the university that Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon has so readily agreed to become a resource person for this course, and she has agreed to deliver these lectures and share her understanding of history and literature with us. So a very warm welcome to Professor O'Hanlon and to all of you. I can right away see that it is going to be a very enjoyable week, apart from many other things for all of us, and that is truly a great privilege for this center. I thought that I should also share with you, and in particularly with Professor O'Hanlon, our thoughts in having this kind of an online course. A few years ago, the government of India has started this initiative called GYAN, which was a global initiative on academic networking. So this academic networking part in that initiative was our first cue, and then the pandemic situation and when our entire life shifted online, that was our another cue, because the GYAN program of the government was abandoned, uh, obviously because of the pandemic, but also because of several other reasons. And we thought that we are going to lose this very important opportunity that in fact became more meaningful for the state public universities like ours in inviting scholars on the campus and having interaction with them, lively interaction with them. But as a via media and as a compromise, although many of us don't really approve of the online mode of discussions really, and I know that Professor O'Hanlon would also agree with me, but still we thought that this would be our opportunity to invite her and also to share all her expertise with our students, where they can have this lively interaction. And that is why we thought that we would request the university to chip in and initiate, organize this something on the lines of GYAN, although it may not completely replace the idea of GYAN, where the scholar is expected to be on the campus, but it will be some kind of a possible opportunity to replicate that at some level. So we are really glad that you agreed to this sort of compromised formula of the GYAN course. And I'm really glad and thankful to the university for accepting our idea, this idea, and chipping it with some small resources which were necessary for organizing this course. So I welcome you all once again on behalf of the university, on behalf of this center and myself, and I hope that all of you would benefit a lot from this course. Thanks to Professor O'Hanlon once again. Over to her.
Well, welcome all of you. I do thank my hosts, Professors Deshpande and Kambojkar, and particularly the University, Savitribai Phule University of Pune, for giving me this wonderful chance to meet with colleagues, friends, fellow scholars, up-and-coming students, the scholars of the future, to share some thoughts at this very interesting juncture in world affairs. It's really something that I see as a privilege, and I do thank you all very much indeed for giving up your time. I'd particularly like also to thank Mr. Avadut Dongre, who prepared a most efficient and wonderfully colloquial set of Marathi translations of the PowerPoint slides that you will all have if you would prefer to consult those. I should explain that whilst my reading knowledge of Marathi is reasonably good, spoken academic Marathi leaves me stumped. And so I hope you will forgive me if our conversation is in English and I speak to the English slides. If anyone wants to ask questions, prefers to type their questions in Marathi, Shraddha is going to read them out to me from the chat box and translate as she goes. So once again, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for coming. And I will turn now to share my screen. Okay. The course is Approaches to History and Literature in the Post-Colonial World. And today's lecture really looks a little bit at this category of post-colonial history itself. We gain so much more in understanding, I think, of this question if we look at it in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that's really the value of pursuing these twin tracks of history and literature. Let me turn now to the key aims of the course. Well, the first, I really got three aims. Well, no, in fact, two aims, if I can be precise. And first is really to explore the many challenges to history as a discipline that we are encountering in today's world. You'll be aware, many of you, of the nature of these challenges. Challenges from popular and subaltern classes wanting to write their own histories, challenges from a new generation of populist leaders who are trying to recreate the past in their own image, challenges from the internet, from virtual communities, social media, challenges to all forms of established expertise, professional knowledge and authority. After all, why not go to the internet to look for answers rather than consult a dull old academic? So that's the first aim of these classes. And the second aim really has to do with literature. Now, literature, as you will know, also, like history, seeks its own kinds of truth about human experience. How does that search for truth help us to understand the challenges that history as a discipline currently faces? And of course, when we say literature, particularly in the Indian context, or in any context, we remember the very many genres that we're talking about: plays, prose fiction, ballads, life stories, historical novels, poetry. In all of these genres, communities outside the academy find ways to express their histories and identities. So what relation do these bear to, as it were, history as we understand it? Now, something that I think is an important point to take on, and this is really an elementary point, and that is simply that in pre-colonial India, history was not written in a single genre called history in the way that it was, broadly speaking, in the Western world. Rather, very many literary genres acted as vehicles for the telling of histories. So you will be familiar, many of you, with these literary genres: Tariq, Kaifiyat, Tazkira, Sira, Puran, Katha, Kavya, and so on. So that's all the more reason for us in the Indian setting to think more closely about the relationship between histories and literature. And if indeed it is the case that only with the coming of colonialism was a genre, an intellectual genre called history, as it were, popularized in India, did it enter the intellectual discourse, does that mean that history as a discipline must be seen as an essentially Western and therefore colonial form of intellectual practice? So the classes, oh, sorry, jump to slide. The classes this week will draw on examples from Mughal history, from colonial history, and from post-colonial India. And we'll finish with a class about reading recent Dalit life histories as a way further to pursue these questions about the relationship between history and literature. Now, just as an example to get you thinking, many of you will have heard about, you won't have experienced yourselves, the great occasion of Shiva Shruti that took place in Shivaji Park in Mumbai in 1974. The occasion, of course, was the 300-year anniversary of the coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And this was a most wonderful occasion. I think we would now call it a part of heritage, something in the interface, in the ground between history and human experience. But it was a form of heritage which went to great lengths to reconstruct the day of Shivaji's consecration as very best as could be done, all the way to bringing very carefully from Satara the sword of Shivaji, the Bhavani sword of Shivaji, so that it was part of the event. And there are very many, if you want to research this event, you will see how very authentic many of the details of this event were. A great deal of trouble went into it. Baba Saheb Purandare, whose name will be familiar to you, assisted with many of the details of staging. So for us, how do we classify an event like that? Is it history? Is it heritage? And of course, that raises the question, the distinction between heritage and history raises the fundamental question for us of the presence of the past. Heritage is something that happens in the present. Heritage, when we go to a museum or we attend an event like Shiva Shruti, we are participating, if you like, in a heritage industry. So it's something in the present, but which tries very hard to connect with some version of the past. Now, I don't need to tell you how very present the past is in India today. We've seen, particularly in the post-Mundal world, a whole range of new confrontations. From within professional history, of course, we have subaltern studies. Then we have emerging a whole range of regional, linguistic, ethnic, sectarian, and gender histories as challenges from outside the academy. The huge university expansion from the 1980s, of course, added to this sense of challenge, this sense of tremendously vibrant, but very often challenging and even confrontational conversations. This, of course, is the robust politics of India's democracy. And at the forefront of that politics have been, of course, Dalit studies, Bahujan histories, claiming their own spaces, not just in popular discourse, but challenging academic forms of history. And then, of course, we have saffron agendas and their critics. And the critics, as you'll know, amongst them are the eminent historians Romila Thapa and Wendy Doniger. And of course, these have been only intensified in the wake of the whole Babri Masjid affair and its aftermath. Now, when we look at these confrontations, probably the two intellectuals that come most readily to mind, at least in my own experience, are India's two really immensely accomplished historians, Professors Partha Chatterjee and Dipesh Chakravarti. Now, to state the obvious, these two historians critique what they call history's grand narratives. The grand narrative emanating really from European experience of a great global progression from tradition to modernity, a progression that was brought by, first of all, by Europe's Enlightenment, which brought new forms of rationality to the world, so the model goes. In challenging this model, our two historians also emphasize the limitations of academic histories which focus on the nation state, the history of the nation state. And they suggest instead that we should really be paying more attention to the worlds of myth, popular history, the world of popular imagination, and as Chakrabarti calls it, enchantment, which are present in many popular understandings of the past. In spite of this, almost everywhere, it's still national histories that take precedence when we think about history and when we think about our cultural identity. So there are those clashes. Then, of course, further clashes, the presence of the past. Right across the world, we have movements, really new movements that put post-colonial perspectives to us in a novel way. The quote, "Rhodes must fall" movement that across the world, which originally focused it started in South Africa, but it came to my own university town, Oxford. There's a prominent statue of Cecil Rolls, the great empire builder, in Oxford, so that there are long agitations that this statue should be taken down. And of course, in the last 3 or 4 years, the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been more recently translated into Dalit Lives Matter, again, we have the presence of the past with all of its challenges. And there, of course, are also horizons in the future which offer, which challenge our sense of the relationship between the past and the present. Some historians now write what they call post-human history. That's to say, histories of the Anthropocene, that era which is really traceable in geological time, which marks the way in which human activity, and I'm thinking principally of global warming, which marks the way in which human activity has started to affect the very behavior of our planet and of the life systems on which we all depend. So for Chakrabarti, this development, in a kind of ironic way, brings the universal back into our conversation. It brings the universal back because if this damage to global life systems continues, then we are all in the same boat. That there is a universal human subject who stands to suffer and eventually to become extinct if those, unless we can find ways to slow and halt that threat. So those are some of the challenges that we think about when we think about the relationship between history and the present, and particularly in India. Now, I want to turn now to look at this very slippery word, post-colonialism. What does it mean? Well, it's a broad term. There is post-colonialism in almost every discipline, not just history. For history, post-colonialism focuses on the historical study of colonialism, not as a kind of material phenomenon, but as a discursive phenomenon, as a phenomenon that has to do with bodies of knowledge. So it's a critique of Eurocentrism for the way in which the knowledges which were collected during the colonial era about India, about colonial societies, continued then and really were not seriously challenged for many decades. Now, I think we can see three important influences in the critique of post-colonialism And this is really across the board, not just for India. First of all, work that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, is Edward Said's work, Orientalism, published in 1978. And of course, what Said pointed out was knowledge as a form of power, and a form of power, a form of knowledge which transcended any individual voice. So colonial discourse is an assemblage of authoritative voices, which is just there. It's difficult to transcend. It's difficult for any of us to affect it because it runs across so many fields of knowledge. And for Said, who drew on this idea of discourse that had been originally developed by Michel Foucault, for Said, the great unexamined aftermath of colonialism was, of course, colonial knowledge. Then a second important influence, this is a name which may be less familiar to you if you are a historian, although perhaps not if you are a student of literature, and that is the great scholar Hayden White, with this book, Metahistory, The Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe, published in 1973. And for Hayden White, the really useful thing is, for historians, the really useful thing that Hayden White does is to remind us of all of those dimensions of history writing, which are actually literary in nature. You know, we may be very sober and scholarly historians, but when we write, we do all sorts of things that writers of literature do. We implot the narrative, the arc of our argument. We persuade, we use images, we cajole, we inject feeling into our analysis. So in all sorts of ways, there is that important common ground between history and literature. Oh, sorry. And the third important influence on this post-colonial moment were forms of crisis and division in Marxist history writing. We have Marxist history writing, older forms, of course, which focused very much on the material, on the base and the superstructure, as if you could distinguish between the material and the cultural. And I've indicated here a number of the historians who certainly saw themselves as operating within the Marxist tradition, but who tried to come up with new ways of thinking about the material world and the world of culture. Ranajit Guha and the Subaltern Studies series, which has done more than any other, I think, than any other approach to help us rethink the history of colonialism. Guha and Subaltern Studies were, in fact, the inheritors of these three streams of thought, and you can see all of those streams of thought in the various stages through which Subaltern Studies went since it first began publishing in the early 1980s. Now, of course, we ought to remember that critiques of colonial culture long predated this moment, our moment of post-colonialism, and I've indicated some of the names there that were very too well associated with critiques of colonialism for me to need to rehearse them. The two sources that I suggested you look at today really approach this question of colonial culture and its connection with the nation state, approach it in two rather different ways. Tagore, in his text, Nationalism, really takes issue with the whole phenomenon of nationalism. You know, for Tagore, nationalism is a way of dividing people, community against community, people against people. Nationalism, he sees it as driven by the Industrial Revolution and all of those dehumanizing forms of economic change associated with it. So that is one type of critique, of post-colonial critique. Then if you compare this with M.G. Ranaday's, our own M.G. Ranaday's Rise of the Maratha Power, equally in its way, a history, but a very moving history of the history of Maharashtra over many centuries. But Ranaday's approach to the idea of the nation is in a way rather more conservative, in that for Ranaday, the key thing is to demonstrate, the patriotic thing is to demonstrate that Marathas were at a particular point in time a nation in the making. So for Ranaday, I mean, he doesn't really go into the whole implication of that in a way that Tagore does, so perhaps we shouldn't compare them so very closely. But I think these two approaches to the nation and its significance for history are instructive, and I'm not going to dwell on them here, but I welcome questions about them in the discussion. Now, let me turn to speak a little bit about Dipesh Chakravarty's work, and forgive me, those of you who are all very familiar with it and don't need an introduction. But if you'll bear with me, sometimes some of his work, his ideas are complicated, and I find it useful myself just to go back to the beginning and think, okay, what was it that he has suggested to us? The chief point of Chakravarty's book, which the first book really which brought him to such prominence, Provincializing Europe, his point of critique, of course, is that we should stop thinking of Europe as the model for everything else, as the paradigm which all of us sooner, which all other societies are sooner or later going to follow in the same trajectory. Now, it may be that that from the point of view of today, and Chakravarty was writing some 20 years ago, that the point of view today with the rise of India and particularly the rise of China, that perhaps we don't feel anymore that we need to make that case. If anything, the European model now looks to be very much on the defensive. But when Chakravarty wrote his book, Provincializing Europe, that was really at a time when across many different genres of history, there was still the assumption that there was this thing called tradition, and Europe was the first to break free of it and to make the transition to modernity, to the nation state, to industrialization, to forms of liberal democracy. And of course, Chakravarty's complaint is that the implication is that every nation's history or every people's history that doesn't follow that trajectory is in some way an aberration, either history just hasn't happened to them yet, or if it has, it's just a form of cultural mimicry of Europe. And Chakravarty was particularly critical of old-style Marxist history, which didn't make any allowance for that phenomenon which the Indian situation presents us so often, which is apparently tradition and modernity, feudalism and the postmodern sitting side by side in the same society. How can this happen? According to the Marxist approach, at least the old-fashioned Marxist approach, that this should not be possible. So just a little bit exploring further what Chakravarty is saying to us about implications for history writing. Chakravarty is very much, if one were to ask Chakravarty about to assess Ranaday's model, I suspect he would say that Ranaday's model shows how colonialism brought in the idea of the nation state and taught Indians to understand their freedom as citizens only in terms of the history of the nation state. So for someone like Ranade, freedom meant being a nation. If the Marathas were to be free, had the opportunity come at an earlier time, they would only have been free if they had come together as a nation. And Chakrabarti proposes that we need instead to decenter Europe, what he calls to provincialize it, to make space for histories that follow different dynamics. And as we do that, to learn much more than we do with our old style top-down histories of the nation, to learn instead from popular memory and experience of subaltern subjects. And in connection with that, Chakrabarti sees the task of history as part of a collective effort to help the subaltern classes of today how to be the democratic agents of tomorrow. And here Chakrabarti makes a distinction between History 1 and History 2. And I find this a very useful distinction, and you'll see that I've used it in forthcoming classes. By History 1, Chakrabarti means professional history, evidence-based history, university history, as we would understand it. Whereas History 2, he classes as the world of popular histories beyond the academy, histories that are that have an overt agenda, a religious agenda, a political agenda, a caste, a sectarian agenda. And here the kinds of history which he's talking about under History 2, you will have read a little bit about if you've read the Badri Narayan article on your reading list. So let's turn now to think a little bit about post-colonialism as a kind of political practice. How can that be? What could it mean? Well, I think the key point to remember about Chakrabarti's position when he says provincializing Europe is not that he's saying we must reject Europe, because after all, what could that mean? I mean, how could we physically do that when so much of Europe across the world is baked into our infrastructures, our ways of thinking, our ways of consuming, and so on? What he means rather is that we provincialize Europe as a way to re-examine all of those intellectual, political, cultural categories that are so familiar to us that we think we know what they mean. Individual, citizen, community, secularism, work, rights, gender, and so on. We need to step back and think we know what these mean because Europe, in a way, many of these originated, the formal meanings that we are familiar with originated out of European Enlightenment tradition. We need to step back and think, how can we reinterpret these in the light of our own historical and political experience to make them useful to us in our own present day? So I think that's a useful lesson, I think, that Chakrabarti makes, point that he makes, that provincializing Europe doesn't mean rejecting Europe. It means re-examining the concepts that that long period of colonialism and its aftermath, when nationalism reigned undisputed as a political concept. It means reinterpreting all of the concepts that we inherited from that period. And as a consequence, Chakrabarti suggests, what we do by re-examining these concepts is to create new political spaces that very many more popular and local voices can be heard in. What are we left with? Well, we are left, in a sense, with a new ground for contest. We're left with India's, and we're left with all of those democracies and authoritarian regimes, all of those political regimes in which popular voices are able to make themselves heard, are able to contest for influence, are able to challenge political regimes and governments. And a part of this, of course, is history, is claiming histories for themselves and using those understandings of their own history to advance their political agendas, to strengthen their sense of themselves as having important, dignified histories, to strengthen their sense of themselves as people with agency. But what does this mean for what we might call History 1, history as the professional discipline? And this is really Chakravarti's question. And this is a question that I hope we can really visit and revisit over the course of the week, which is how can popular or overtly politicized history be admitted to the world of professional historians on equal terms? Can it be admitted on equal terms? What should the relationship be? If it's admitted on equal terms, what does this do to the authority of History 1, of, as it were, professional history, university history, and so on? I should just say that in saying that university history is broadly apolitical, of course, that is a gross oversimplification. The very fact, the very existence of university history is itself a political fact. But I am trying to draw a broad distinction, which I think is nonetheless useful, between historians who try to work with evidence, who work in professional communities, who take who think of their primary obligation as producing historical accounts and analyses which are faithful to the evidence as it has come down to us. A distinction between that history and popular histories which pick and choose the evidence, or which go looking for whatever they designate to be evidence. So I still think it is useful to use that History 1 and History 2 model that Chakravarti has suggested. And so to finish, I want to leave you with these 4 proposals. These 4 proposals, which we'll allude to during the week, are my personal way of saying that, yes, that there can be a dialogue between these forms of popular history and the literary genres in which many of them are written. There can be a dialogue. Not only that, but it's vital that there should be a dialogue. And I've set out here my 4 proposals. One, that what distinguishes history from what distinguishes History 1 is first the attempt to link specific events and the writer's own analysis. 2, conventions of verification, that for History 1, you don't just say something and say, well, it's in the archive over there. What you do is you submit your use of archival or other evidence to validation, to tests as to whether particular accounts accord with what we know from other evidence. Thirdly, and this is hardly contentious, historians work with communities of practitioners. We, all of us, when we're there struggling with our bits of historical writing, we very often feel very alone, as if history is just something that happens in our writing, is something that happens in our own head. But of course, we work all the time with other historians, other scholars who may be interested in interdisciplinary things, other scholars who may be interested in literary history. And this is one such occasion. We are a community of scholars trying to think about why we do what we do. So communities of practitioners. And then lastly, and again, I think this is not contentious, but its implications are contentious, that history 1, like history 2, will always be a dialogue between the present and the past. After all, where else can we get our questions about the past from? Our questions about what's important. We can only get them from our own experience, from our own present. Of course, once we have our questions, we trek off to the archive or papers or oral histories, whatever it is we're using. And if we find that, in fact, the questions we thought were interesting, they don't seem to find any echo there, but in fact, other questions are interesting. So what we do is we shift our questions. So there is that dialogue between the present and the past. So those are, as it were, my 4 proposals. We'll be coming back to those. But those proposals are my way of saying that I think there can be, that there must be this engagement between history 1 and history 2, between history 1 and other genres in which history, like literature, in which popular histories are written. So that brings me close to the end of my slides. And it is that what I want to emphasize is that it's in these settings that, in these, accepting these proposals, that the truth claims of history lie. And these are not, I think, incompatible with post-colonial critiques, because we're not saying that our history comes down from somewhere else. We admit our history 1, is something that we create, but we do create it under particular circumstances. And in fact, we need to remember that professional history has very long existed in a contentious dialogue with these other forms of amateur and popular histories. And in fact, most historians, most professional historians would agree that these histories, popular histories, have been the most potent sources of fertilization for professional history. We tremendously value them. So when Dipesh Chakrabarty says you should go away and talk to some popular historians, we say absolutely. We also recognize that post-colonial history contributes very legitimately to histories that are usable for subaltern communities in the present. Now, I say usable, and perhaps some of you may be thinking, well, but how come is history just something that is only important if you can use it? What does that do to history's objectivity? Well, it is a painful truth that most historical fields are abandoned, not because somebody has proved them wrong, but just because they cease to be of interest in the present. Again, we come back to that sense of history as a dialogue between the present and the past, in which we construct our narratives and our questions that come ultimately out of our own present concerns, but we submit them to those elements of historical practice that we call a discipline. People will, I know in some perspectives, the very word discipline is tainted. It's a kind of Enlightenment word. But by talking about a discipline, we mean things like practices of verification. We mean things like making sure that we listen to fellow historians and follow their critiques. So that brings me to a close for today. Tomorrow we'll be looking at post-colonialism and approaches to Mughal history. So I will now stop sharing my screen. I can pull slides up again if anyone wants to draw attention to particular slides. Over to you chaps, if any of you has questions that you would like to ask.
Thank you, Pauline. That went beautifully.
I slightly overran. I will try and keep it a bit shorter for tomorrow.
Not at all, not at all. Let's just wait for a few questions and comments. I don't see anything in the chat box, but if you're okay with it, Polly, can people simply raise their hands and ask?
Yeah, if people, I mean, writing in the chat box it takes a really long time.
Yeah.
So if people would like to just stick their hand up, then let's have a discussion in that way.
Yeah. So let's see if there are any raised hands. Yeah, Harshita. And then Nabila. First Harshita, then Nabila, then Veer Pratap. Go ahead, Harshita.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
So my question was that when you were talking about the relationship between a professional and a certain political history and the kind of level of interaction that should take place, I was wondering, obviously we can learn so much in the way that the politicized history is perhaps written, but how could we perhaps also allow a certain degree of encouragement of politicized history to borrow from a certain professional history knowledge? So for example, when I was reading Badri's article, he takes this case study of Mithila where there's a story of a Mosul caste versus the Dome caste, and how when writing Dalit histories, there's a tendency to homogenize the Dalit identity so that the internal factionalism is sort of hidden and there's a collective identity assertion. But at the same time, it also stands true that within the supposed monolith of Dalit identity, there are multiple contradictions and so many levels of oppressions per se. And I was wondering if there is actually a common point when you talk about the usability of history for the subaltern. Where do we sort of build this common point?
Well, I think this is something that really needs to be done at the level of kind of face-to-face interaction. Because it's at that level, it's when you're having discussions, of this kind, that you can talk about, how particular, how say a homogenization of Dalit history is useful in some ways because it brings Dalit history to a wider audience. But at the same time, anyone, a literary person working with Dalit writing, will also be very sharply aware of its internal tensions, its internal differences, contradictions, and so on. So I think that partly that conversation, I think, needs to happen at the level of conferences, at the level of verbal interactions, rather than declarations from academic history that this is the way you have to write history, and if you write particular things, then I have to tell you it's wrong. It demands both sympathy, it demands both insight and fellow feeling from the professional historian as to why it is particular popular histories are written in the way that they are. And it also demands fellow feeling and respect from the other side, because after all, we can be very sympathetic to popular histories and respecting their sense of identity. And if it doesn't quite correspond with everything that we know about evidence from the archives, we also have to remember that there are many types of politicized history that that we might not like, that people who write politicized histories of a kind whose agenda we would want to dispute. And in those cases, it's actually very useful to be able to say, I'm afraid what you've said simply doesn't accord with the evidence in the archive. So I think, these are conversations which need nuance, and such conversations are best had face-to-face in conferences like this, in the sorts of camps that I remember having been to as a younger person in the sort of 1980s and 90s in Pune and around for sort of women's history. These were, very intense conversations that academics and activists had, and they were most productive and fruitful. And so, does that make sense, Harshita? Does that?
It does, ma'am. I just had a clarification to seek. When we talk about such conferences and conversations, what is the kind of traction the mass has to them? So there's a certain language of academia that is often employed. There's this allegation that elitism is a way of gatekeeping knowledge. So how do we sort of democratize it, for a lack of a better word, without losing what the essence of perhaps the idea is, instead of too gentle?
So I have I'm very sympathetic to the idea that some forms of academic language can act as gatekeeping. I mean, I struggle with some of the post-colonial texts. One, you think you have to read it 4 times before you understand what they're getting at. And I think an awful lot of the time, people are writing a kind of word salad, if you know what I mean, and it's not necessary. For the most complicated ideas, it is possible to express them in ways that are accessible. And that is something that, of course, as students, you are not necessarily encouraged to use simple language. And in fact, at a certain phase in your academic development, the ability to use fancy phrases is like a mark of your intellectual accomplishment. But eventually, and sooner rather than later, students, I believe, should learn to do the most difficult thing, which is to write complex ideas in accessible language. So I don't believe, for a non-academic who is willing to give it time, who is willing to listen, I don't believe that there are ideas that are sort of beyond them, and we have to accept that as a gulf between us. That's not my experience. And any more than, I hope, for academicians, if a member of a subaltern community explains, why it is this particular practice or this particular belief or this particular story matters, then if that is done in accessible language, then understanding should be possible. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
There's a question from Nabila, and then Veer Pratap.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I wanted to ask, how do we attempt to historicize narratives that we know have certain elements that are fictionalized or even mythical? So, for example, when we look at narratives of the kingdom of Bali Raja, or even stories of popular folk heroes, I mean, how do we place these within the academic discipline?
Well, the first thing is to take Hayden White's lesson, his argument, that in fact, in a very real way, what we write as historians is a kind of fiction. That's to say, we tell our story. It's not the case that fiction is over there and history is over here. History one also tells stories. That's to say, we construct a narrative, we select examples, we choose the things that appeal to our imagination. Very often we use historical imagination to fill in those things that we can't know, to convey something of a sense as to how people might have been feeling when they were experiencing a particular event. Part of the answer has to be to recognize what it is as historians we do, that there is a large part of what we do that is literary. But that said, we have, going back to my 4 proposals, we have these, if you like, guardrails that keep us from, that anchor us. It doesn't mean that we give up attempts to to use metaphors, to persuade, to use our imagination, to make assumptions. No, but we subject those to what we can see of the evidence, to tests of validation, to the critiques of our own fellow community of historians. That's to say, your friend in the next door office who says, this is rubbish, you know, you've overread this evidence, go away and rewrite it. So that's the first thing, to recognize that the limitations, that the literary nature of much of professional history. But then coming to, you mentioned the figure of Baliraj in Phule, and the way that, I mean, so this is a subject for a talk later in the week. But when I looked again at those elements in Phule's text, what I thought of it as was a kind of historical sociology. That's to say, it's not that Phule is inventing all this. It's not a simple, entirely imaginary construction. In fact, it is, what he is doing is taking real things, a whole set of real sociological aspects of his own contemporary culture, practices, rituals, beliefs, dates in the ritual calendar, and he is using those to give his account traction, so that it is so that what he's proposing about Brahmin dominance and the Aryan invasions, what he's proposing is recognizable to his audience. So Phule is not, he's not inventing things. I see it as a kind of it's a historical sociology. So, you know, our approach to a work like that, or to someone who says, look at this, you know, look at his great history. What we, you know, we don't say, well, this history is nonsense, it's all made up. What we say is that as a scholar, which Phule undoubtedly was, he caught onto an idea in his own time, which was a very powerful idea, Max Müller's idea of the Aryan invasions. He caught onto that, used that as the arc, the narrative arc for his history, but then he populated it, not with evidence from the past, because of course, you know, he wasn't an Indologist, he didn't read Sanskrit, he had a living to make and a career to make and people to support and a movement to support. So what he did was he took sociological things from his own time and used those to give his account a basis in reality, a basis in truth. So, I mean, that's an example. You know, from that point of view, you know, I have the utmost scholarly respect for what Phule did. This isn't something which you would just say, oh, he can, you know, it's all invented, all this, the Dashavatara stuff is all invented. He uses those things to give his account a structure, very sensibly, but then he takes everyday practices in the style of a sociologist. So if we were to think of Phule as a kind of historical anthropologist or a historical sociologist, I think we would have a better way of classifying him. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
We had a raised hand from Veer Pratap, but in order to counterbalance between the Zoom call and the YouTube live, Veer Pratap, I'm requesting you that maybe I can read the question from one of our Zoom Facebook live participants, if you are okay with it, Veer Pratap.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Okay, in the chat box, Professor Rohanlan, I can see a question from Meghana Arora from Facebook Live. She asks, how do we understand time and resources to read, write, and reflect, shaping regimes of practices, as mentioned in your last slide? And a follow-up question. Similarly, media and funding can promote history more strongly. And would that be a materialist argument? That's what Meghana asks.
Shraddha, I can't see that question in my chat box.
It comes from Rahul Magar to everyone.
Oh, it's from Rahul. Thank you very much.
It is
so much,
pasted from
yes, yes, I see. Yeah, yeah. So I don't know whether Meghana's question, I suppose everybody can see Meghana's question.
Yes.
Does she mean this is all very well, but people don't have time to do this? You know, how do people get time to read and reflect? Well, of course, that is undoubtedly an important point. But if you're thinking about popular histories, in fact, people do find time. I mean, the time that people find is evidenced there in the great outpouring of popular histories. If that's what is meant there, can media and funding promote history more strongly? Well, I mean, the thing is, I think part of the difficulty of these conversations that we try to have over the ground between History 1 and History 2, part of the difficulty of those conversations, I think, is that on the one hand, History 1 is reluctant to, or finds it difficult to concede that part of what they do is literary in nature, because they worry that if we concede that point, then the authority of our discipline will disappear. On the other side, History 2, very often, particularly in our world of social media, in which communication is in Twitter length messages, and people live in a kind of echo chamber of their own people who think like themselves, it becomes very difficult to promote history or to promote conversations of this kind. But I think, I nonetheless think that promoting conversations of this kind is the best way to serve the needs of both History 1 and History 2. But at the moment, this is a difficult task because, I mean, for reasons that you are all familiar with, we live in a culture where people shout at each other, and listening is not a virtue. And of course, in our whole clickbait culture, the louder you shout, the more clicks. And if you're looking to monetize that, which, you know, very many people are, so much the better. So this doesn't make for conversations. So, you know, this is a difficult environment to make the kind of argument I'm trying to make in, but all the more important in my eyes to make it. Okay.
Right. Now the question from Veer Pratap.
Veer Pratap, please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, so the question is more about the politics of history writing, and how do we understand the process of history writing by historians when their writing claims to highlight a particular kind of idea from the marginalized history, and writing and about the practices. But while in their practice or in their professional life, they take up a totally different stand against the histories they are trying to highlight. So where does this line lay that distinguish them from an attempt to bring that history of those left out, and mere being an opportunistic to grab a chance in a heated topic of their time?
Well, I mean, I think I think an important step in this conversation, you know, in trying to promote that conversation, to promote understanding of the relationship, is some humility for History One. That's to say, to recognize that what they do, in some respects, not at all every respect, but in some important respects, may be more like history, that History One may be more like History Two than they like to assume, that History One has these literary dimensions. And it also, I think, demands from History Two, from History One, a recognition that when History Two makes a kind of absolutist claim, or when somebody, you know, usually somebody else makes a History One claim for history, you know, a claim that History Two is actually a part of History One, is really to look at that more carefully. I mean, and this goes back to the answer I gave you about the Foulet text, which is to say that we can assume simply that that text is nothing other than History One, is not very helpful. It's not helpful because History One, as we understand it to be now, is not how people were writing in those days. Foulet himself did not represent himself as an academic historian. But if we look at what he was doing in his own context, we find that it, as an intellectual practice, it has a lot of aspects of, well, you could call it Sociology One. That's to say, he's taking things from his own society, things that are real, things that he observed around him, things that people would have recognized, and he's putting that into his History Two account. So it also means respect for the intellectual practices of History Two, trying to work out, you know, what does it tell us about History Two that these arguments are made in that kind of way? And asking that question is very good for History One, because it's what History One should be doing. We should be trying to think about, why is somebody writing history trying to do it in this way? So it's useful for that reason. It expands our understanding. And it also shows an appropriate academic respect for forms of History Two, which acknowledge that they also deal in, as it were, truth, and that those truths may be sociological truths from their own, what they observe around them, or they may be emotional truths, things that they feel very passionately. And so our job then is to ask, well, why do they feel like that? How does that? I think we, Shraddha, can you hear me?
I think there's some internet.
I think the YouTube, I think the Zoom or the YouTube just dropped out for a moment. But so, you know, that's a slightly complicated answer, but I think that's why I say that these conversations are better had as conversations, not as tracts of defense and attack on both sides. Does that make sense, Veer Pratap?
I guess so.
Okay,
Yes,
right.
There was a disturbance with the internet, so maybe Veer Pratap also got a bit lost in cyberspace, maybe.
Okay.
Anne has the next question. If Veer Pratap has something to say, he will come back and say something from.
Correct.
Anne, I think, has Anne Mary.
Thank you. So I had two questions. Both the questions are continuation to the questions that were raised earlier. So one was regarding the Badri reading. And while I was reading the Badri reading, even I felt the same issue with the whole homogenization. And there was this another reading that I want to continue.
And
Yeah.
will you please switch off your video because we can't hear you properly.
Okay.
Yeah, can you just go a little bit slowly, Anne, please?
Okay, is it fine right now?
That's better, but just go slowly.
Okay, so I had two questions. Both are continuation to the previous questions. The first one was regarding the Badri reading. And I had this issue, the same issue raised by Harshita earlier regarding the homogenization.
Yeah.
So there was this other reading that I had to do for my academy. It's a reading by Koka, and it's on class consciousness. So even there, the same issue was raised that for a very long time, the scholars wouldn't take the class as a homogeneous unit, and so which would lead to generalization.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I can use the term caste consciousness the way class consciousness can be used, but so for something to reach the point of class consciousness, what my understanding is that one should have a shared experience, and then a collective identity is created, and from that there's a class consciousness created. So when we try to when let's say Dalit is seen as like a homogeneous unit, aren't we only looking at history from the point where there is this caste consciousness, let's say, where the shared experiences have come together, and then they see an identity within that. So are we? So isn't there? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but then isn't there a gap between the previous heterogeneous histories they had? This and then the history later on, one can call it after caste consciousness, that part of history. So as Professor mentioned right now, that it's during these conferences we can kind of shorten the gap between these. But my question was, even when we speak about conferences or academic spaces, again, there are restrictions, right? So in that case, we'll be mostly going for the autobiography. But then the question is raised regarding the... Hello?
Anne-Marie, some of that I didn't quite pick up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I think I picked up enough to answer to attempt an answer.
Okay.
Again, I think both sides have to appreciate that the other side has multiple audiences. For History 1, a practitioner of History 1 may be wanting, for example, to write a very good, up-to-date textbook in which there's a textbook of Indian history, say, in which he or she wishes to include 2 or 3 chapters on the experience, on Dalit experience, the experience of Dalit women, the question about whether class consciousness and caste consciousness intersect. And that historian will be doing their very best to bring those histories to a wider audience, to people who wouldn't otherwise read that kind of history at all. At the same time, so if you say to that historian, well, you've homogenized all this experience, that historian's reply will be, well, if you want me to talk about these topics in a textbook, there has to be some degree of generalization. That said, if I was writing, if my study was devoted to Dalit questions or women's questions, of course, I would want to go much further into it, and I would want to explore the fractures, the contradictions, the alliances in much greater depth. And similarly, the historian has to understand that history too, practitioners of history too, are also have to deal with multiple audiences. So they are addressing audiences from the political platform. They are addressing audiences in discussions with History One, audiences when they write articles which they hope might be accepted for a newspaper, for an academic journal of a, like EPW, that they hope will to be able to bring some aspect of the experience that they know and to put it to a wider audience, which will include history practitioners of History One. So, I mean, that in a way, so I'm kind of saying the same thing, which is to work out how can we have this dialogue between History One and History Two, or between History One and people who write historical literature as a vehicle for a political identity. In order to have that dialogue, these are the questions that we have to think about. It has to, there has to be respect on both sides, and some ability to imagine, to enter into the position of the other side. Okay, what is it that they need to do? Just as I would hope that they would ask, what is it that a History One needs to do? So I think that's the best answer I could give you. All too often, difficulties are created because History One bangs the table and says, we deal only with empirical evidence. We don't use imagination. We don't make things up. We don't write fiction. Unless you do those things, you can't have anything to do with the history as I write it. And that, I think that is a very short-sighted and over-simple understanding of what it is that History One actually does. In my eyes, rather than expecting the world of popular history to clean up its act and stop making things up, we first of all have to, as people whose job it is to think about intellectual matters, we first of all have to focus on what it is that we ourselves do. And then we can, I think, be in a better position to approach that conversation.
Thanks, Professor. I have one more clarification to need. So
and
it was
your connection is very, very weak, Anne-Marie. Could you please type it out? We have enough time, and I'll read it out, Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
We really can't hear what you are saying.
Okay.
Will that be okay, Anne? Yeah. Thank you so much. And sorry to have cut you short like that, but we really can't hear anything.
The question here from Rohini Shukla is an interesting question. I think, Shraddha, I see it in the chat. Perhaps I could just engage with that for a moment. Those of you, I hope, can see it.
Sure.
The question about oral history, if we want to write a history of centuries for which we don't have oral sources. Well, of course, absolutely. I mean, oral sources, there are very few historians now thinking about history too that don't use oral sources in some fashion. The question is, what actually are oral sources? So very many written texts started out life as oral sources. So if you take, for example, the record of assembly debates, legislative assembly debates, they started out as debates. Very often, the oral sources that colonial historians might use will now be in textual form, but they started out as oral sources because somebody was going around collecting ballads or collecting poems, collecting stories, and so on. And of course, because in the Indian setting, so much culture was oral, and I include the very many literary categories in which history was written. Those are originally oral categories. So the problem isn't so much we haven't got printed text, so we must go for oral ones. The initial problem is more that a lot of our printed sources were originally oral in nature. And so what does that mean for the way that we read them? For example, second part of your question, how can we use oral sources? Could we use oral sources for something like a subaltern history of the 18th century? Well, absolutely we could. So what oral sources might those be? Some of them are very obvious. Some of them would be sectarian histories which are passed down by word of mouth, which at some point become concrete in literary text, in texts. So for the religious historian, say somebody who's working on the Bhakti tradition, say somebody who's working on Eknath or Tukaram, the question is, how did the tradition about those poets, how did that tradition form? At what point did particular accounts become canonical, become authoritative? So they are investigating exactly that question of the transition from the oral to the textual. This is something that we'll be looking at in later classes, but very many of the histories that we have for the 18th century started out as oral histories, whether these are sectarian histories or katha, literary histories, whether they are in the Marathi genre as bakar. You know what is a bakar. Some of these started out as oral sources. And in fact, an awful lot of the things that we think of as printed accounts, as written, were first of all dictated to scribes. So in a way, the question is not, should we go oral or shouldn't we? The question is, oral is there, we can't escape it. The question is, how do we use it in a way which is not distorting? If you see what I mean. Okay, thank you for that question.
Do you want to read from the chat box and answer, or Professor O'Hanlon, or?
Now, so has Anna-Marie sent her question to the chat box?
Not as yet.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me just run down.
There's a question from Rupesh Madkar, which Rahul has sent from the Zoom thing. He's talking about Ganesh Devi and amnesia.
Right. Okay. I'm not as familiar with this reference as I should be. Can you explain the reference a little bit more to me? Can Rahul explain the reference, or somebody else explain the reference?
Rupesh Madkar is asking, in order to understand changes and continuity of practices and traditions, societies in pre-colonial period, how can we overcome the problem of what Ganesh Devi has called as amnesia? So Professor Devi in his book called as After Amnesia.
Oh, I see. Yes, thank you. I'm not familiar with that text. So presumably this is what did he mean by amnesia? Is this a particular type of forgetting? What is the form of amnesia that he's talking about? Or, can anyone enlighten me on anyone else familiar with this book, After Amnesia?
That's okay though, because there are a number of other questions as well.
Okay.
Nadi asks about historical fiction and whether it adheres to conventions of history one.
Wait a minute. So which question are we on, Shraddha?
The very last one.
Nadi Pashika. Well, so that's a very good question. Thank you, Nadi. That's a very good question. Well, I don't know. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the British writer of historical fiction, Hilary Mantel. Now, Hilary Mantel does exactly what you have described. That's to say, she creates, and you know, this woman has won 2 Booker Prizes in the last 10 years. And she does exactly what you described. That's to say, she does all of the research that she can. You know, she goes to the archives, she reads the original documents, she talks to other historians, she verifies what she has, she does everything that a professional historian would do. But what she then does is she narrates from the point of view, not in this case of a minor player, but from the point of view of Cromwell, who is a very major player, as if we were privy to Cromwell's thoughts. Okay, so, but the principle is the same. What if she had been doing it for a minor player? So how do we class this? How do we class this? Well, if you listen to Hilary Mantel, and she is, I do urge you to Google her and find some interviews with her, because she is endlessly interesting about exactly these problems. She, you know, she says, of course, yes, I'm writing history, but in the end, I am writing fiction because I am imagining the sorts of things that Cromwell might have done, and particularly that Cromwell might have thought, as I imagine he might have thought. You know, if you said to her, are you primarily a novelist or a professional historian? I think she would probably say, I am primarily a novelist, but I adhere to the conventions of professional history. And of course, nobody didn't, I mean, some people do criticize her work because they say, well, you know, did she not know that Cromwell's 3rd son was born in 1522, not 1523? And to which the intelligent reply is, that details like that don't matter to her, because what she is primarily trying to offer us is a sympathetic imagining of Cromwell's inner life. And for it to be convincing, she has to make it realistic. She has to do all the research. Now, if she gets one date wrong by a year, say, that really doesn't matter. So does that make it? Does that answer the question there, Nadi? I hope so.
Yeah, she's watching from Zoom, so maybe.
Oh, she can pick that up later. Yeah. So then Anne-Marie.
Yeah, Anne-Marie has typed
She's
her question.
Yeah.
Also, there was a comment by Chinmay Dharurkar earlier. If,
yes, ek minute. Chinmay. Yes, ek minute, Chinmay. Yes, I mean, I'm entirely sympathetic to what you say here. Of course, historical linguistics and a history of language are very different things. You know, you need to be something of a linguist to write a history of language, but a history of language is very much a history of culture. You can't, you know, because language, the way that you speak, the way that you write, is such an instrument of power that it is a most compelling phenomenon. And if there is a gatekeeper, actually, if there are intellectual gatekeepers, it's not the small, so much the small, do you understand this concept or do you understand that concept? If there is a gatekeeper, it is, you know, broader kind of mannerisms, the way that you present yourself, the way that you know to engage with others. You know, in terms of Bourdieu, it is the cultural capital that we bring to our conversations. And so this is again something where I believe that face-to-face discussion is a tremendously important thing for developing that relationship between history 1 and history 2. Do you see what I mean, Chinmay? So that each side can learn about, you know, how do you have authoritative exchanges? How do you present a case in a way which has traction, which your audience will understand and will think, ah, yes, this person understands us. So thank you for that, sharing that thought. Now, I don't know, shall we pick one last one, Shraddha?
Sure. We have time, actually. We have 20 more minutes.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm looking at my English clock, and in fact, of course, we still have time, don't we? Because we are not running. You are running on the hour, but I'm running to the half hour. Well, so nobody has a hand up. So let me look back through the.
Yeah, there's plenty of questions in the chat box.
In the chat box, okay. So Anushree Pathak, all along objectivity has been important to history. That's to say, considering your own bias is very true. But these biases are the basis of the popular history. Well, so this is where I think that history 1 needs to be more sympathetic, needs to show greater understanding of what popular history is trying to do. Because popular history, you know, as we saw in the case of Fulle, popular history doesn't very often simply invent things. They may take things that are true and put them in different contexts. They may take things from their own experience and use them for more general arguments. But so I would not I think bias, you know, of course we have to have that word in our armory. So, you know, in all sorts of arguments that you might have with people, you want to be able to say, well, in the end, this is a very biased account. When we look at when we look at Mughal history next week, a classic example would be scholars who represent Mughal history as nothing but 200 years of oppression of Hindu religious culture. And that is simply not true. because you can point to all sorts of things which show how Hindu religious culture flourished under Mughal rule. So you need to be able to, one needs to be able to say that that biases certainly exist. And, you know, sometimes we have to recognize that you just cannot have a conversation with someone. You know, I've emphasized that conversations are important, but a conversation means two parties willing to listen to each other and willing to examine their own position. And if one of those parties, you know, whether it be the historian saying, I write objective history, or whether it be the popular historian saying, you know, the Mughals did nothing but oppress Sanskrit learning, then you can't have a conversation, because a conversation means two parties willing to listen. You know, so that's why I would, as far as possible, you know, if you're hoping to have a conversation, then I wouldn't use words like bias, because bias is bad, but bias is not something I do. And, you know, you know, of course I have biases, but I know that what they are, and I set them on one side. You, on the other hand, you have biases. So it's, you know, it's such a loaded term that it's not a very good term to use in a conversation. If you're trying to have a conversation, then, you know, it's best until, whilst you're still trying for some kind of genuine exchange, it's best to avoid loaded terms. But, you know, some people you can't have a conversation with. And some people will say of us, you can't have a conversation with them because, you know, they've made their minds up. So I think that's the way that I would respond to that particular, the way that that term is used in Badri Narayan's work. So who else? Tanya? I mean, you know, presumably everyone can see Tanya's question in the chat box. So, you know, are they, you know, is it the case that these women, you know, that there's a trend of representing women from the past in ways which are masculine but wifely? These are hegemonic representations of so-called freedom fighters. So what do we do about these things? Well, I mean, I think if you're a historian of, you know, if you're trying to do history one, a historian as a historian of gender, then you look at, you know, you look at what the experience of those women, as far as one can discuss, as far as one can know about it, you try and look at what that experience is. You know, of course, you know, we know all about hegemonic representations of women, that, you know, women can be wifely but modern, or women can be, you know, they can be like Phulan Devi, they can be, you know, bent on revenge, but it's understandable because look at how she was treated. And I think, you know, when it comes to the representation of women, I think, you know, because ways of representing women are so fundamental to the power structures in our culture, I think there we have to be particularly careful about how we do it. And, you know, in a way, there is a place for romanticization in the sense of, you know, if we are trying if we are trying to end, if we are looking at a female figure who was, say, a freedom fighter in the colonial era, or someone like Fulan Devi, then of course, very often we don't have access to that person's thoughts and feelings. Now, we perhaps have accounts of them as they appeared to observers. And so what we do as historians, as evidence-based historians, is we make assumptions. We make assumptions because they are reasonable assumptions. And any honest professional historian should admit that a reasonable assumption is a key part of their toolbox, because there is so much that we can't know. Event A and event B, how are they connected? Well, we construct the connection, and where we don't exactly know what the connection is, we make reasonable assumptions. So that's not a very good answer, Tanya, to your question. But I hope that's my best response. Let me look down now.
There's a question from Nabila.
Nabila, एक minute. Further down. Is it further down?
4:36 p.m.
To what extent is it possible? Is that the one? To what extent is it possible to read official sources against the grain? Well, I mean, of course you can do that, and it's what very many people say that they're doing, and it's one of the ways in which we can know about the experience of subaltern classes who may only have left records of themselves, say in legal cases. Of course, I'm familiar with Guhar and James Scott. I mean, the danger, of course, is that we think, well, here we've got this text, I'm going to read it against the grain, and maybe what I'll do is just turn it upside down and assume that if the prisoner is represented as very passive, that this is everyday resistance, because everyday resistance can be just kind of standing there very passive. Well, there are two problems with doing that kind of reading against the grain. One is that one should never simply assume that you can invert an image and because all you've got is the same image but turned upside down. So reading against the grain doesn't just mean inverting an image. But the more important thing, and this comes to practices of verification, the more important thing is to find other independent evidence which seems to confirm the assumption that I am the reading that I'm taking from against the grain, which may just be my assumption that this is what this really means. If I can find the same thing reflected in an independent source, say perhaps a life history or a newspaper article or some other observers witnessing of that event, then reading against the grain works much better. It is a much more sure way of not putting your own assumptions in where they're not warranted. So again, it's a bit like oral history. It's not should we use it or not. Of course we should. The question is how do we go about it? And where does it belong in our, if I can put it, in our toolkit that we use as historians or as people who write literature but engage with history. Okay, so let me see what other so Krishna to everyone. by making such distinctions between history 1 and history 2, do we create a hierarchy between them? Can we not democratize professional history writing? Well, two questions here. One is, there is a hierarchy between them, and that hierarchy, partly it's a kind of an inherited hierarchy. You know, it's a legacy from the time where university historians were personages of dignity and authority, who are not used to being shouted at by people who said, you don't know anything about my history. So there is a legacy there in which it's assumed that professional history is the more dignified, the more truthful, the more authoritative. But there is also a serious point there, which is, you know, why? Well, so this is my question. This would be my question to some of you. I mean, do people like me and Shraddha matter anymore? Is what we say, does anybody take any notice anymore? You know, it's, and of course, you know, people other than us are better equipped to answer that question. You know, you could take the view that, in fact, these fields of history 1 and history 2 have grown so far apart and nobody takes any notice of history 1 anymore. So why should we think it has any authority anymore? But, you know, this may be my flattering myself as a as a historian, a history 1 historian, that because, you know, whatever their political understandings, people in the world of history 2 know that on the whole, people in the world of history 1 have actually gone in and looked at the documents or the archives or consulted the oral traditions or are aware of a whole set of debates. There is a kind of reluctant respect for that, or if not respect, there is a sense that at the very least, you know, there is a sense that you have to, that this is a person, that these are views I should take some account of. Now that may be by saying, well, these university academics, they're all lefty liberals, so we shouldn't take any notice of what they say. For others, what history 1 says matters because there is still some respect for the professional knowledge that history 1 has taken trouble to gather. And, you know, in my experience, people are very keen to know what did you find, what did you think. They're not just saying, oh, we agree that you're right, but there is a respect for the fact that history 1 does take time, because it has time, to go and explore evidence, use techniques of validation to test out the opinion amongst the community of fellow practitioners. So, you know, there may be a residual sense in which people think, oh, history 1 is superior. But my plea to history 1 is that practitioners of history 1 need, on the one hand, to say, there are intellectual practices which I do and try faithfully to carry out so that you can trust what I say. But at the same time, history 1 needs to have the humility to say, at the same time, part of what I do is write stories like you, history 2. So there is a humility, I think, that history 1 needs to understand in its engagement with history 2. So that's the first half of your question. Then, can we not democratize professional history writing? Of course we can. That's to say, we can open, I mean, it is open. I mean, we don't, people who right forms of agenda-based or popular history are free, insofar as they have time and resources, to do what professional historians do. But that's not very helpful because, of course, many of them don't. So how do we, as it were, democratize? Well, exactly as I've described. You know, we try to promote conversations of the sort that I've described, in which professional historians are very clear that there are some things that they do and they have to, but there are other things that they have the humility to accept are much more in common with history too. In terms of, and in other ways, to promote better understanding between, as it were, the two sides, by also recognizing that, in fact, there are many areas of history too where you would have to say much of what professional history writing does, not all of it, but recognizable parts of it, is there in the history that popular history practices. So, in a way, the task of democratizing it may not be as formidable as, if you recognize the commonalities that are there, it's perhaps not so formidable as you might think, if both sides are willing to have a conversation. That's the point. If one side or other or both are not willing to have a conversation, then there's nothing to be done. So I hope that, Krishna, I hope that's helpful.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
So Harshita, I see your comment there, and I would absolutely agree with you. We can't use oral sources in a silo. And this comes back to, a very basic point about history as a discipline, which, I hardly need to tell this audience, which is that when you're looking for evidence, you look for as many different sources of independent evidence as possible. So you would never simply rely on an oral history. And if that was literally all you had, then your task would be different. It would be more of a literary thing. It would be more looking for, you would be admittedly simply looking for internal evidence because there was nothing else. So people are right to say that reliance on oral sources isn't appropriate for history. But even if you have an oral source and that's all you have, then very often if you read an oral source carefully, you will find internal evidence in the text. So you will find evidence, for example, with some of the phrasing, that in fact there were sort of questions and answers going on, that there was a dialogue in there, or that some bhakti text, from the way that it's written, was originally sung. So even if all you have is oral, then you can make some internal guesses, assumptions, reasonable assumptions about the history of that text, about the audience for that text. And of course, it's audiences which are always the hardest thing to find evidence for. So I hope, Harshita, that gives you some sense of an answer. Let me go back up through the other questions. Nabila. Now, Anne-Marie.
I tackled most of them.
Have I tackled most of them? Well, there's Anne-Marie here. When we write histories on folklores, well, I mean, I suppose the answer to your question is straightforward. It is a part of our training that we try very hard to know what our biases are. That when we look at opinions that are very biased, that we don't, or that go against our biases, that the first thing that comes to our mind is not, that's very biased, but what would have led that person to think like that? There's a very interesting podcast at the moment, or it's an episode in a podcast that I listen to about history, and somebody's written a book called The History of Britain in 50 Texts, and one of the texts is an absolute denunciation of anything to do with women's rights. You know, if women were to give up their traditional duties as wife and mother, the whole society would come falling down. You know, nobody should listen to these mad ideas, wicked people trying to corrupt innocent women by leading them astray like this. And of course, you know, you're looking at it and you're thinking, oh God, you know, how can I read this? And then you get down and you find who wrote it, and it's Queen Victoria. So, you know, you think, so this is rather interesting that this woman who vents these unacceptable opinions, yet she herself is one of the most powerful women in the country. So immediately, you know, so as soon as you, I mean, so this is just a practical observation about how I think a lot of historians work. You know, you find something, and of course, in our everyday work, we come across this all the time. You know, whether you're looking at, you know, I mean, in my own recent work about caste in early modern India, you know, one of the things that I was reading was this text by a late 15th century pundit who was kind of like, you know, really fed up that people are forgetting the proper caste order in my society today. And, you know, this is how people should live, Varnashram Dharma. And if you go against Varnashram Dharma, you will be born as a worm in cow poo for the next 100 years. And of course, it's really rather, I mean, it's revolting. But you don't, the main thing that you look at is not, oh, this is revolting. The main thing you look at is, why is this person making this case? And that immediately, it cools your outrage, and it gets you into something which is much more interesting than your outrage. It gets you into the subject position of the person writing. So that's I hope, Anne-Marie, that is to answer your question. There's another question from Chinmay. Well, so you're absolutely right, Chinmay. This week and next week are a little bit more on the history side. And then I'll be talking a bit more about literature later in the week. I suppose the thing that the main thing that the main way in which I think about these things is that history and literature both have their own kinds of truth, and the truth of literature is the truth of human experience. I mean, when we look at any work of serious literature, we want it to speak to us. You know, it may be conveying some world that we know absolutely nothing about, in which case, you know, it's great, it's escapist, it transports us. Other forms of literature may be much closer to our own experience, and then we look for it as a way of expanding our own experience, because we find this vision of emotion or suffering or joy. We find that we recognize ourselves there, that it speaks to us, and you know, in the way that poetry speaks to us. Some poems speak to us in a way that other poems just don't, and that's how we judge them. We say this is a wonderful poem or a wonderful novel because it speaks to, it's it is true in that it offers us an emotional truth which expands our own sense of, expands our understanding. So both history and literature deal with forms of truth, but history deals with particular truths, whereas literature deals in a way with truth that has the potential to be a universal truth. I mean, later in the week, of course, we will look at the Dalit life writings, and I like to think that what is great about those writings is, in part, this ability to convey suffering and community and identity and grief and joy, but to convey it in a way that ultimately transcends the Dalit position, so that it broadens our experience. It shows us that, okay, this is a world very far removed from mine, but it has opened to me a very small and fragmentary window on that experience, which I can understand. And so these will be some of the ways in which I'll be reflecting on the notion of truth, the kinds of truth that we find in literature. And, if you talk about what makes great literature, well, one way of saying what makes great literature is that it's universal. It has the potential to speak to people across many cultures, across many times. A poem written 1,000 years ago still speaks to me, and so I say that is a great poem because it transcends the particular experience of the poet writing it. So Chinmay, that is my answer. But we'll be coming to these questions later on in the week. So I don't know whether there's anything there in the chat.
There are a few questions for Professor O'Hanlon, but I think we've superseded our time slot by about 10 minutes.
Right.
So, maybe I'll keep a track of all the written questions, and then we can club them together, and when we have time, maybe tomorrow.
Exactly. Yeah? Exactly. Yes.
Will that be all for today, Professor?
I think so. Yes, I think we're over time, so we should stop. But I do thank all of you for being so very disciplined, that we can have a conversation, because Shraddha and Rajeshri and I are a little bit worried, what if everybody puts their hand up, or but everybody it's so well, part of my theme has been conversation. So it is very nice to be able to actually see you all and talk to you. So Shraddha, we will wind up. Later today, you will receive the PDFs of tomorrow's PowerPoints, the English and Marathi PDFs, so that you can follow along whichever of those suits you from your point of view. So, okay, Shraddha, well, shall we say goodbye, and you'll close the meeting, and we'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed for your attention and for your excellent questions.
Thank you, Professor O'Hanlon. See you guys tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.